The wedding reception took a sudden, icy turn when Mark's parents stood up and left just before my speech. Margaret's voice, sharp and cutting, rang out across the room, ensuring everyone heard. We only came to support our son, not her. A hush fell over the guests. The murmurs of conversation ceased, and I could feel the weight of 100 eyes shifting toward me. My mother looked stunned. My father's face darkened with anger. But the only reaction from Mark was a shrug and a weary sigh. At least they showed up. I took a deep breath, steadied my trembling hands, and picked up the microphone. I forced a smile, one I knew would unnerve them more than any outburst ever could. Then they're going to love what I have to say next. At the entrance, Margaret and James hesitated. Their satisfaction faltered, their steps slowed. I wasn't going to mention this tonight, I continued, my voice calm and steady. But since we're all being so honest, let's talk about it. Margaret's smirk vanished. James stiffened. Mark and I signed a prenuptial agreement, I said, letting the words settle before I delivered the final blow. And it has a clause. If he ever gives financial support to anyone outside of our marriage without my consent, he loses access to our joint assets completely. A gasp echoed through the crowd. Margaret's face drained of color. James took an involuntary step forward, as though he could stop me with sheer presence alone. I met their eyes with unwavering confidence. So, if you thought you could guilt him into financing your lifestyle like before, you might want to rethink your strategy. Silence. Then a single clap. Another. Until a wave of applause swept through the room. The warmth of the crowd's approval wrapped around me, drowning out the humiliation staining Margaret and James's features. Without another word, they turned on their heels and stormed out, shoving past servers in their haste. I set the microphone down. My heart pounded, my hands still shook, but in that moment, I had never felt stronger. The calls began that night. First to Mark, then to me, then to my parents. Margaret left me a venomous voicemail, spitting accusations of manipulation and gold digging. James, ever the strategist, sent a scathing email claiming I was isolating their son, controlling him, twisting him against his own blood. Mark ignored them all. When the threats started, hollow attempts to challenge the prenup, our lawyer barely suppressed a chuckle. The agreement was airtight. Mark had signed it willingly, after thorough review with his own attorney. There was nothing they could do. Frustrated, they turned to their last weapon, gossip. They whispered to their circles that I was a conniving woman who had ensnared their son, a parasite draining him of everything. But Mark was no naive boy, and those who knew him respected him too much to believe their desperate lies. Cornered and defeated, they played their final card. Margaret called with one last, brittle pronouncement. Since you've chosen her over your family, you are no longer our son. Mark's response was simple. Okay. And he hung up. For months, silence followed. No calls. No emails. It was as if they had vanished from our lives. And for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Mark and I settled into our new life. We bought a house in Charleston, poured ourselves into our careers, and for once, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for their next attack. But Margaret and James were not the type to lose gracefully. It started with a bank notification. I was out running errands when Mark called me, his voice laced with confusion. Did you take money out of my personal account? No, I said immediately. Why? There's a withdrawal, he said, his tone tightening. A big one. My stomach twisted. Check the details, I urged. Minutes later, he sent a screenshot. A wire transfer. The recipient? A trust fund Mark hadn't even known existed. Call the bank, I said. What we discovered sent a surge of fury through my veins. Years ago, James had set up a trust fund in Mark's name, a fund James still controlled. And because Mark's name was technically on it, his father had withdrawn money, making it appear as though Mark had authorized the transfer himself. Two things became clear. James still had access to financial accounts Mark hadn't even known about, and he had just stolen from his own son. I trembled with anger, but Mark, to my surprise, laughed. They're desperate, he said, a glint of something cold and certain in his eyes. And desperate people make mistakes. Without hesitation, Mark dialed his father's number. James answered on the second ring, his voice as smooth as ever, as if nothing had happened. Mark, he drawled. Nice of you to call. Cut the crap, Mark snapped. Where's my money? Silence. Then a slow, patronizing sigh. Technically, James said, it was never your money. It was set aside for you. And since you've made it clear you want nothing to do with this family, I figured it would be better used elsewhere. Mark clenched his jaw. You stole from me. James chuckled, unbothered. You should be grateful. Do you know how many people would kill for a family like ours? His voice turned colder. And yet you threw it all away for her. Something in me snapped. I grabbed the phone. You listen to me, you smug piece of. Mark gently took the phone back before I could finish. I don't care about the money, he said, his voice firm. I care about the fact that you think you can control me. That stops now. James scoffed. And what exactly are you going to do, son? Mark smiled. Watch. Then he hung up. James thought he was untouchable. He wasn't. Mark went straight to a lawyer. Though James had controlled the trust, he had not been legally permitted to use the money for personal gain. We had a case, and we filed immediately. James never saw it coming. Panic set in. Within days, Margaret and James were scrambling. They called family, friends, even Mark's old colleagues, spinning a new story, one where they were the victims and I was the villain. Margaret, in a last-ditch effort, even called my mother. I know you're a decent woman, she pleaded. Please talk some sense into your daughter. My mother laughed and hung up. Their desperation reached its peak when they did something truly reckless. They showed up at Mark's office. But no matter what they tried, they couldn't rewrite the truth. This time, they had already lost. Mark's career had taken him to one of Charleston's top financial firms, a place where security was tight and uninvited guests were swiftly dealt with. But that didn't stop James and Margaret from trying. One afternoon, they stormed into the building's lobby, demanding to see their son. They caused such a spectacle that security had to physically escort them out. The firm's executives were livid, warning them that if they ever showed up again, they'd be reported for harassment. That should have been their final attempt at control. But James and Margaret had one last card to play, a cruel, desperate move designed to manipulate Mark's emotions. It was a quiet Saturday night when his phone rang. The number was unknown. He hesitated, then answered. A woman's voice, shaky, distressed, came through the line. Mark, it's your mother, Margaret sobbed. It's your dad. He had a heart attack. Please, you have to come. I sat up immediately, my pulse spiking. Mark's face went pale. Where is he? His voice was tight, urgent. St. Joseph's Hospital, she sniffled. Mark didn't even hesitate. He hung up and immediately dialed the hospital. My heart pounded as we waited for the receptionist's response. But when she finally spoke, my blood turned to ice. I'm sorry, she said. There's no patient by that name admitted here. Margaret had faked a medical emergency, lied about James having a heart attack, just to get Mark to call her back. That was it. That was the moment Mark finally broke. He looked at me, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling with restrained fury. I'm done, he said. I reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. So, what do we do now? He exhaled slowly, the weight of years of manipulation pressing down on him. Then his expression hardened. We end this. Mark had tolerated his parents' games long enough. Their guilt trips, their sabotage, their desperate attempts to control him. It had to stop. And for the first time, he wasn't just going to walk away. He was going to fight back. But James and Margaret weren't finished yet. A week later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Thick. Official-looking. Mark and I exchanged wary glances before tearing it open. Inside was a copy of a will. Not just any will. Their will. And they had rewritten it entirely. I scanned the pages, my hands shaking. They had done exactly what they had threatened. Mark's name had been removed. No inheritance. No access to the family's fortune. No claim to any of the assets his family had amassed over generations. But that wasn't the part that sent a chill down my spine. It was who they had replaced him with. Mark's cousin. Andrew had always been the golden child of the extended family. He attended the right schools, had the right career, and, most importantly, married the right kind of woman. Now, James and Margaret had made it official. They had legally adopted him. Mark's replacement. My breath caught as I read the cold, calculated words on the document. Since our son, Mark, has chosen to abandon his family, we have made the painful decision to remove him from our legacy. In his place, we name Andrew as our rightful son and successor. I looked up at Mark. His face was unreadable, his lips pressed into a tight line. They adopted Andrew? I whispered. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. Of course they did. I placed my hand on his arm. Are you okay? He shrugged. I mean, it's not a surprise. This is exactly what they wanted, right? A son they could control. Before I could say anything else, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. When I answered, her voice was shaking with rage. They called my boss, she spat. I blinked. Wait, what? They called Lisa at my school. Left a message saying I raised a manipulative woman who's destroying their family. A slow, burning rage spread through me. Margaret and James weren't just trying to ruin Mark. They were coming after me now. Mark's hands curled into fists. His voice was low, dangerous. Enough. We're ending this for real. I frowned. How? He turned the will over in his hands, then tossed it onto the table. We fight fire with fire. James and Margaret thought they had won. They believed that cutting Mark out of their will would be the ultimate punishment. They had no idea what was coming. Because Mark? He had a plan. Step 1, expose Andrew. Step 2, destroy the reputation James and Margaret had spent their entire lives protecting. Step 3, make sure they never recovered. James and Margaret's power came from their name, their money, and their social standing. They controlled people through guilt, intimidation, and carefully curated appearances. But Mark had something they didn't: respect. People liked him, trusted him. So, when we found out that James and Margaret were hosting a lavish dinner party to formally introduce Andrew as their new heir, Mark saw an opportunity. I'm crashing it, he said. You want to just show up? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Not just show up, he smirked. I want to expose them. The event was held at the Savannah Golf Club, an elite venue filled with their closest friends, business associates, and extended family. It was meant to be their grand moment of triumph. We walked in like we belonged there. The room fell silent. James stood so quickly his chair nearly toppled over. Margaret's face drained of color. Andrew looked bewildered. What are you doing here? James snapped. Mark smiled. Oh, I'm just here to celebrate the new heir. He let the words ring through the hall. After all, it's not every day you get legally replaced. Margaret forced a tight smile. This isn't the time, Mark. Isn't it? He said, feigning innocence. You sent us a copy of the will. You made such a big deal about cutting me out. Why not celebrate properly? Margaret's fingers twitched against her wine glass. Mark pulled out his phone. Oh, and before I forget, here's proof of you harassing my wife's mother at her job. Gasps. Margaret flinched. Mark pressed play. The room filled with Margaret's own voice. I know you're a decent woman. Can you please talk some sense into your daughter? More whispers. Margaret paled. James clenched his jaw. But the real betrayal came next. Andrew turned to James and Margaret, confusion clouding his features. You told me Mark walked away, he said slowly. That he didn't want to be part of the family. Mark smirked. Oh, that's cute. They didn't tell you, did they? Andrew hesitated. Tell me what? That they cut me off because I refused to let them control my life, Mark said. That they adopted you because you're more compliant. Andrew's face paled. You said I was the rightful heir, he whispered. That it was always supposed to be me. Margaret finally snapped. Of course we were using you, she hissed. The room fell deathly silent. Andrew staggered back, his eyes wide with betrayal. He turned to James, then Margaret. You never cared about me, he whispered. Margaret didn't deny it. Andrew's face twisted with anger. He grabbed his drink and, in front of everyone, poured it over James' head. James and Margaret lost everything that night. We walked away for good. And Mark, he was finally free.